We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Beis Amid Beis Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 42b. This daf is sponsored by Shalom ben Noim in memory of Moshe Leo ben David. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amid or a daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amid, the Gemara quoted a rule from Rav Chisda that anything that is allowed to be done by a non-Jew, so then if a Jew does that, there is no bracha. But if it is not allowed to be done by a non-Jew, so then when a Jew does that action, it's considered to be a mitzvah in which one does make a bracha. And the Gemara in the previous Amid said that this rule of Rav Chisda is actually refuted from the case of tefillin, and the Gemara now is in the middle of bringing a brayso. So the Gemara in the previous Amid said that it was taught by Rav Chinana, the son of Rava mi Pasharnia. It was taught by Rav Chinana, the son of Rava from Pasharnia, that is a place. The following brayso, the brayso says, Sefer Torah tefillin mezuzos shakasvan seduki kusi ovid kochavim eved isha v'katan mumar psulin. If you have it, Sefer Torah tefillin mezuzos, if they're written by a tzeduki, by a kusi, by a non-Jew, by an eved, by a woman, by a katan, which is a minor, by a mumar, or some have a meshumad, by a Jew who's an apostate. In all of those cases, psulin, we say that it is possible. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, ukshartem uchsaftem. It says you bind the tefillin, and then it says uchsaftem, write them. Kol sheyeshno b'kshir, and we darshan as follows: if the individual is part of the mitzvah of binding, of wearing the tefillin, so then yeshno b'ksiva, so then he's also able to be one who writes them. But kol she'eno b'kshir, but if he's not able to bind them, eno b'ksiva, he can't write them. And so we see from here clearly that a non-Jew is not able to write the tefillin. Uvi Yisrael, and when it comes to tefillin, if that's true, according to Rav Chisda's rule, so when a Yisrael would write the tefillin, he should make a bracha. But that's not true. Uvi Yisrael ein tzarech levarich. By a Yisrael, when he's making the tefillin, when he's writing the tefillin, there is no bracha. The shalach Rav Chia b'rei Rav Huna mishmei Rav Yochanan, because Rav Chia the son of Rav Huna sent in the name of Rav Yochanan, al tefillin shal yad omer baruch asher kedishanu b'mitzvos of etzivanu lahaniach tefillin. On tefillin shal yad you make the bracha of lahaniach tefillin. Al tefillin shal rosh omer baruch asher kedishanu b'mitzvos of etzivanu al mitzvahs tefillin. On tefillin shal rosh the bracha is al mitzvahs tefillin. Ve'ilu lasos tefillin, and whereas a bracha of making tefillin lo mevarich, there is no such bracha, and that's why it is a refutation of Rav Chisda. And Rashi explains, Tziduke Ovid Kochavim. We'll take a look at the Mesoras Hashas. The Mesoras Hashas has a different girsa. Mesoras Hashas says the girsa is min goy galach. It means to say like a non-Jewish priest. Now, why are we talking about a non-Jewish priest? Why not simply say a non-Jew? Rashi explains, Lahachi nakat the stame baki b'ksiva. We're choosing the priest because he's an expert at being able to write. So we're trying to choose an example of someone who is at least capable of writing. And again, if it's done by a non-Jew, so then the Brisa said it's not kosher. And so the Gemara now continues, now that we have refuted Rav Chisda, so what is the rule? How do we determine when a bracha is made and when the bracha is not made? And the Gemara continues, Elolav hainu taima, rather isn't the reason as follows: Kol mitzvah da'asiyasa gemar mitzvah, any mitzvah where performing that mitzvah is the finishing of the mitzvah. Kagon mila, for example, bris mila, when the mila is done, that is the mitzvah. Afal gav dechsheira b'ovid kochavim, even though it is kosher to be done by a non-Jew, b'Yisrael tzarech levarich, but the halach is if Yisrael does it, he has to make the bracha. V'chol mitzvah da'asiyasa lav gemar mitzvah, but any mitzvah where doing that is not really the finishing of the mitzvah. Kagon tefillin, for example, the writing of tefillin, that's not the mitzvah. The finishing of the mitzvah is the putting on the tefillin. So afagav de psulos bovid kochavim, even if writing the tefillin is disqualified for a non-Jew to do it, but by Yisrael eino tzarech levarich, by Yisrael there is no bracha again, because it is not the gemar mitzvah. And the Gemara continues, if that is the case, we now need to explain what's the machlokas we had in the previous Amud with regards to the making of tzitzis. There was a machlokas whether a bracha is made on the asiyah, the making of tzitzis, or not. And so the Gemara continues and explains uvit tzitzis, b'hakam iflagi. By tzitzis, they're arguing as follows: Mar savar, one holds chovas talisu, that tzitzis is an obligation on the garment. So then the making, the inserting of the strings, the making of the tzitzis requires a bracha. Umar savar, and the other opinion holds chovas gavru, it's an obligation on the individual who's wearing the garment, and so therefore the making of the tzitzis will not require a bracha. And the Gemara continues, Amalei Rav Mordechai l'Rav Ashi. Rav Mordechai said to Rav Ashi, Atun hachi masnisu la, you learned the entire Gemara before as above, but anon hachi masninan la, but we actually teach it as follows. We teach Rav in the opposite way. That Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, Minayin l'tzitzis ba'ovid kochavim sheksheira. From where do we know that tzitzis, if they're made by an ovid kochavim, they're kosher? Shenemar, as it says, Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'asu lahem tzitzis. It says, speak to b'nei Yisrael and they'll make tzitzis. And we darshan that to mean Yasu Lemacherim, others are able to make the tzitzis for them, and that means to say that if it's made by an Ovid Kochavim, it is kosher. And Rashi explains, Tefillin Asiyason Lo Zuhi Gemar Mitzvasum, Tefillin, the making of the tefillin is not the Gemar Mitzvah, it's not the finishing of the mitzvah, Ad Sheyiksharim, until the tefillin are worn. Baha Pligi, Rav Nachman, Rav Chisda, Alibe de Rav, Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda are arguing according to Rav as follows. Rav Chisda Savar Tzitzis Chovas Talis. Rav Chisda holds that tzitzis is an obligation of the talis. Hilkach Asiyasan Hi Gemar Mitzvasan, so the making of the tzitzis is the Gemar Mitzvah, the finishing of the mitzvah. Rav Nachman Savar, and Rav Nachman holds Chovas Gavri, it's actually an obligation of the individual. Vatifasa Zui Mitzvasan, the wearing of it, the wrapping of it, that is the mitzvah. Hachi Masnisula, we learn it as follows. Lahada Amar, Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Le'el, that's going on the statement of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav earlier, Misham Hachi Kasha Lahu Le'el Derav Aderav, because you learned it, Hachi Masnisula, as you learned it that way previously, that's why there was a contradiction within Rav that was brought on the previous Amud, and again, we learn it a different way, so there is no such contradiction in the first place. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Ason min hakotzim, umin hanimin, umin hagardin psula, if tzitzis are made from the kotzim, nimin, or garden, then they are possible, they are disqualified. Kotzim refers to, let's say, the warp threads of a garment, let's say they snap, so they're tied together in a knot, let's say that's towards the end of the garment, so that knot essentially is now sticking out, some threads are sticking out, that wasn't made for tzitzis, but you want to use those threads as tzitzis. Min hanimin refers to embroidery that's at the end of a garment, so there's some threads sticking out of there, again you want to use that as tzitzis. Min hagardin is the warp threads, there's some extra of those threads that hang down, and that also, that's fringes of the garment, one wants to use those as tzitzis. All of that is psula, it's all puzzle, it's disqualified. The reason is those weren't made from tzitzis, those are just extra threads that are sticking out of the garment. But min hasisin, but if it's made from the sisin, which means it's a ball of woven string, so that is ksheira, that is going to be kosher. That was not spun for the purpose of tzitzis, but nevertheless it can be used as tzitzis. But ki amrisa kame de Shmuel, when I said this, Rav Yehuda is talking, when I said this in front of Shmuel, Amar, he said, af min hasisin psula, even from sisin, it is disqualified because it wasn't spun for the sake of tzitzis, but inon tviyah lishma, because Shmuel says, Shmuel holds we require tviyah lishma, must be spun for the sake of the mitzvah. And the Gemara continues, Ketanoi, let us say that this is a machlokas tanoim, whether the strings of tzitzis need to be spun for the sake of the mitzvah. The Brisa says, Tzipon zav o shatola alein or behema tameya. This is talking about tefillin. Let's say instead of enclosing the tefillin in leather boxes, instead it's in gold, or let's say it's the hide of a behema that's not kosher, an animal that's not kosher. Psulos, then it is possible it is disqualified. Or behema tahora, if it's the hide of a kosher animal. Ksheros, then it is kosher. V'yaf al pishalo ivdan lishmon, even though the hide wasn't tanned lishman for the sake of the mitzvah, you don't need the ibud to be lishma, according to the Tanakama. And the Gemara is assuming the same, according to the Tanakama, would be true for the strings of tzitzis. It doesn't need to be spun lishma. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, af or behema tahora, even the hide of a kosher animal, psulos is going to be pasul ad sheyavdin lishman, unless the ibud, the tanning of the hide, is done lishma. And so therefore, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, just like ibud needs to be lishma, so too the spinning of the strings of tzitzis needs to be done lishma. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Abaye Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda. Abaye said to Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda, Hatechelta, with regards to tcheles hechit savisula, how is the wool dyed? And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei said to him, Maisinan dam chilazon v'samonim, we bring the blood or the secretion of the chilazon, which is the snail that the dye is made out of. We bring the dam chilazon, v'samonim means that we bring herbs, v'raminan lehu b'yorin, we cook them in a pot. Some say that we're cooking the dam chilazon together with the herbs in order to make the dye. That's what the Gemara means. Others say the idea is that the wool is steeped in the herbs, and that allows the wool to accept the dye. In any case, again, umar sechinan le, we boil it in the pot. V'shaklina porsa bebeyasa. Then we take a little bit of this dye in an eggshell. V'taminan lahu bu'udra, and we test it on a wad of wool. We make sure that it's able to take hold and that the dye is going to be effective. V'shadinan leilahu beyasa v'kalinan leilu udra, and then we throw out whatever remains in that eggshell. We throw out that part of the dye and we burn the wad of wool because none of that is able to be used anymore for the purpose of tzitzis. And the Gemara says, based on all of this, shma minot loss, shma minot, We see from here three things. Shema Minot Tlos, we see three ideas, and they are as follows. Shema Minot Te'ima Psula, we see that the wool that was tested, that is possible, it cannot be used as tzitzis, as part of tzitzis, as tchelas. Ushma Minot Devo'inon Sevilla Lishma, we also see that the dyeing needs to be Lishma for the sake of the mitzvah. The Gemara is about to ask, that's exactly the same as Te'ima Psula. The reason why Te'ima Psula is because we need Sevilla Lishma. And finally, the Gemara says, Ushma Minot, we also see from here Te'ima Pasla, that little part that remains in the eggshell, if it was tossed back into the vat of dye, Pasla, it would disqualify the entire vat. That's why it has to be discarded. And the Gemara continues and asks, Hainu Te'ima Psula, Hainu Tzviya Lishma. The idea that Te'ima's Psula is the same thing as Tzviya Lishma. If it wasn't dyed for the sake of the mitzvah, so then it's pasul. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Ravashi says, Matam Ko Amar. We're giving the reason over here. That's what's being said. Matam Te'ima Psula. What's the reason that Te'ima is Psula? Mishum Devo'inon Tzviya Lishma, because it needs to be dyed Lishma. And the Gemara continues, Ketanoi, this issue is a machlokas tanoim, whether Te'ima is psula or not. Te'ima psula mishum shenemar klil techelas, divrei Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. The Brisa says that Te'ima is psula, because it says in the pasuk klil techelas, we'll see Rashi in a moment. These are the words of Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, and so we see according to Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, Te'ima is psula. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavoy Omer, Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavoy says, Afilu mara sheni sheba, even the second mara, essentially meaning the second part of the dyeing process is going to be kosher, mishum shenemar, because it says ushni tolas, and Rashi explains mishum shenemar klil techeles. Again, according to Chanina ben Gamliel, Te'ima is psula because it says in the pasuk klil techeles. Klil techeles is really written by the garments of the kahuna, but we apply it to the tzitzis as well, the techeles on the tzitzis as well. We learn from klil techeles, kol techeles ba'inan, it needs to be entirely techeles. Shehei kol ikar mara hachilazim betzemer. That means that all of the color of the dye is in the wool. Shelo yehei davar acher tzavua b'mitchilasa, that you shouldn't use this dye, this pot of dye, you shouldn't use it to have tested something first, some other wool first. And so essentially, according to Rashi's explanation, other Rishonim disagree, but according to Rashi, the reasoning of Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel has to do with the fact that if it's used for testing, then it's not going to be entirely, the tchelas of the tzitzis are not going to be entirely taking from the dye and capturing all of that color. And then the second opinion of the Brisa was Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavoy. He says Mara Sheni is okay, meaning to say Te'ima is not psula, and that's because of the pasuk Ushni Tolas. Rashi explains Afilu Mara Sheni Sheba, even the second Mara Shekvar Nitzva Bat Samaracher, meaning this dye was used for some other wool. V'zeh Hasheni, and this is the second time, so the color is not as strong. Kosher is still kosher, and we learned that from Ushni Tolas. Now Ushni Tolas is really talking about the red thread, but we learn from the word Ushni, we darshan it like Sheni. Mashma Sheni, de Afilu Mara Sheni Shel Zahoris Kari Tolas, even if it's the Mara Sheni of this red thread, it's still called Ushni Tolas. And Rashi continues, Vu'adin l'tchelas, and the same would be true for tchelas, t'chsiv nami bahukra, because tchelas also is written in that pasuk together with Shni Tolas, with the scarlet wool. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabban, and the sages taught in a brayso, Tchelas ein la bedika tchelas, there's no way of examining it. The simple explanation is that we mean to be talking about bedika, examining to make sure it's not indigo, it's not kol ilon. V'ei nikchis element amumcha, can only be bought from somebody who's an expert. That's the only way to really know that it's real tchelas. And tefillin, with regards to tefillin, yesh lahem bedika, it is possible to examine. One can check the tefillin and make sure it's written properly, but still, v'ei nikachin element amumcha, but still it cannot be bought except from an expert. Otherwise, you're not going to know that the ibud, the tanning, was done lishma. And svarim and mezuzahs, with regards to Sefer Torah, with regards to mezuzah, yesh lahen bedika, that can be examined, v'nikachin mikol adam, and it can be purchased from anyone. And Rashi explains, ein la bedika, there is no way of examining the tchelas, kasal kadaitach. Initially, we think, ein adam yachol levod koim tchelas u'im kol ilan, that a person can't inspect to determine whether it's tchelas or kol ilan. V'ein nikachas ela min hamumcha, can only be bought from an expert. The hoel ve'ein la bedika, since it can't be tested, ein lochen osa ela min hamumcha, one can only buy it from an expert, sheyodeya shekol ilan asr, meaning he's an expert who knows that indigo is prohibited, it's problematic. Tefillin yesh lahem bedika, tefillin can be examined. Adam yachol levot kanim diktek bohen b'chaseros v'yaseros, one can examine the tefillin and make sure there's no missing letters, extra letters, imlav or not, v'afal pichein ein nikachin ela min hamumcha, but nevertheless, even though it can be examined, we can determine whether it seems to have been written properly. properly, but it still needs to be bought from an expert. Because this expert needs to know that it needs to be tanned lishmam for the sake of the mitzvah. And then it said svarim and mezuzahs can be bought from anyone. There is no halacha of ibud lishman when it comes again to svarim and mezuzahs. But the Gemara continues and asks, so tchelas ein la bedika, is it really true that tchelas, there's no way of examining, of determining that it actually is tchelas and not from kol ha'ilon? V'harav Yitzchak b'reid Rav Yehuda. But Rav Yitzchak, the son of Rav Yehuda, bodically, he was able to inspect it, he was able to test it. Maisi migvia gilo umaya deshvelilta umeime raglayim. He brought alum of clay and water of fenugreek and urine, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph.